there's no legal basis for anything that Secretary of Defense Hegseth is doing against Senator Kelly. Secretary Hegseth is engaging in a gross abuse of power and an intimidation campaign against a sitting U.S. senator that has a chilling effect, only for I don't think Senator Kelly's that chilled, but there's a lot of retirees out there, including myself, who are speaking out against this administration. So if Secretary Hegseth can go after a retiree's pension based on post-retirement conduct, a sitting senator, he could go after any of ours.
Welcome back to Just the Facts with me, Jill Wine-Banks, and Rachel Van Landingham, who has been on the show once before because of her military law expertise, law of war, and we have a lot of things to talk about. She was a lieutenant colonel in the JAG Corps. She is now a professor at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles. And there are many issues that are bothering me today, but I'm picking two of them. And we're going to start with the first one, which is what Secretary Hegseth, who calls himself Secretary of War, has done by declaring war on Senator Mark Kelly. And let's start with that one. Rachel, we all have read that he is being looked at for censure, or he has been censured, and they're trying to demote him, take away his rank and his pension, which he earned in his 25 years of service to this country in the Navy as a captain, the equivalent of a colonel in the Army, and as an astronaut. So now, what is the legal basis, if any, for that, Rachel?
Thanks for having me back, Jill. And the bottom line is there's no legal basis for anything that Secretary of Defense Hegseth is doing against Senator Kelly. Secretary Hegseth is engaging in a gross abuse of power and an intimidation campaign against a sitting U.S. senator that has a chilling effect, only for I don't think Senator Kelly's that chilled, but there's a lot of retirees out there, including myself, who are speaking out against this administration. So if Secretary Hegseth can go after a retiree's pension based on post-retirement conduct, a sitting senator, he could go after any of ours. So let's pull the threads here. First of all,
well, let me stop you for a second, because you mentioned one, which is that this attack is for post-service. And as I understand the law, as the former, general counsel of the Army, you can actually go after someone if, for example, they lied in something while they were in the service, if they misrepresented something about their service, but not for something they did as a private citizen, even though they are getting a pension. And not everyone who retires has earned a pension. He did. And so has there ever been a case where a pension has been taken away for post-service conduct?
Yes, but it's through a court-martial. So let's distinguish between criminal prosecution, military jurisdiction, which can result in a court-martial with a punitive discharge, a dismissal for an officer such as Senator Kelly. Unfortunately, it's really a gross vestige from Civil War era. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, federal law, still extends criminal court-martial jurisdiction over retirees. I am still subject to the code. Senator Kelly is still subject to code, which is why we heard Secretary Hegseth threaten to court-martial Senator Kelly back in November when the controversy first arose regarding the video Senator Kelly rightly made that said, hey, folks in the military, obey lawful orders, disobey unlawful orders, which is something as a former JAG legal advice I gave all the time, right? Because it was a statement of the law. But so since he could be court-martialed for post-retirement conduct, because for conduct yesterday, therefore his retirement pay could be taken away if he's actually court-martialed, convicted, and receives a dismissal. And the Supreme Court has acknowledged that. However, he's not being court-martialed.
Could he be court-martialed? Is there any possible basis for court-martialing him for stating the law that you often stated as an advisor to soldiers?
If Secretary Hegseth is following the law, Senator Kelly cannot be court-martialed because there's no probable cause he committed any crime. He committed no
Right.
crime, even under the really restrictive First Amendment speech restrictive military unique offenses that do exist under the military code. They're under no way, shape, or form did Senator Kelly commit any crime, which is why he's not being court-martialed. Instead, Secretary Hegseth is trying to do something he doesn't have a legal basis to do. So now let's go to the administrative route that Secretary Hegseth is proceeding on, unlawfully, in which a federal court will hopefully soon. There's supposed to be a brief due tomorrow morning in the case. Will hopefully declare soon that can't be done. So that is called a grade redetermination. So as you pointed out, Jill, as you know from your time as General Counsel of the Army, folks from the military who serve a certain period of time, typically 20 years, have a retirement that's vested at that point. There are some folks that have medical retirements who retire with a pension earlier. But for the vast majority of retirees from active duty, and that's what I'm specifically talking about, after 20 years, they can apply for retirement. It's like I did, like Senator Kelly did. And according to federal law, the statute requires that a grade determination be made at that point to determine the pension that someone's going to receive. And they have to be retired at the grade they last satisfactorily held. So if there is active duty conduct and really misconduct that comes to light, for example, General David Petraeus, after one is retired, this federal law allows the service secretary to revisit that grade determination to take into account that misconduct that they didn't know about. General Petraeus, it turns out, violated military law by sharing classified information with his paramour without permission, without the appropriate authorities. That's actually criminal in the military. We didn't know about it. The Army didn't know about it until well after his retirement. So the Army actually was considering, under the Obama administration, revisiting his grade determination. But for political reasons, they decided to let it go. And however, the entire statute is very clear in saying the grade determination is exclusively about one's conduct on active duty. So therefore, as the Supreme Court itself has acknowledged in an interesting community property case regarding a retiree, the only way to touch a retiree's grade for post-retirement conduct is to either court-martial them, and there actually has to be a crime, probable cause they committed a crime, so that can't happen here. Or there's a very unique method that could occur, which is called being dropped from the rolls. A retired officer can be dropped from the rolls and therefore not be considered a retiree anymore if they're convicted in a civilian court of particular national security related crimes. This goes back to an old Cold War era espionage type incident regarding it's called the Hiss Act, regarding a spy that was discovered. So Senator
Alger Hiss? Alger Hiss?
Yes.
Of Nixon fame? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So there's only two ways to get out of retirees' conduct while they're retired. Either court-martial them, because there's this ridiculous jurisdiction that still extends, and Congress needs to stop that and stop it now. They should have stopped it a long time ago, and I'll explain why in a moment. I'll explain how it's been used recently, but they can either be court-martialed if they've committed a crime while retired, or they can be convicted in federal court for one of these espionage, national security related crimes that would allow them to be dropped from the rolls. They cannot just be, hey, I'm Secretary of War, Hegseth. I don't like you. I don't like your speech. I'm going to go after you. And oh, by the way, I'm going to take away your retirement because I can. He cannot. A federal court's going to clearly find that he cannot. He's wrong. But it's incredibly scary and troubling that he would attempt this in the first place, because it's so beyond the pale of what is appropriate, what is reasonable, never mind what is lawful and ethical.
Rachel, I have so many questions based on what you just said, but the first thing that occurs to me is that you mentioned that you are on a pension. And I know I've asked you this before, but are you worried, because you obviously have spoken out, and are you worried that they might try to take away your pension?
Well, I mean, hypothetically, I maybe should be worried, but
Yes.
I'm not. But I'm not, because I'm not a sitting senator. I don't view myself as a threat. Yes, I have a public voice and I've used it, but I think I'm small potatoes, right? And I'm not chilled because I was publicly writing against President Trump when he was candidate Trump in 2016 and urged that the US military should be killing family members of terrorists in order to get the terrorists to stop, which is, obviously a war crime. I've actually used contempt. I have violated Article 88 of the UCMJ as a retiree because I have used contemptuous words in public against the president. And I've done so intentionally, not only because I disagree on almost everything that the man does, but because I've also written a long law review article arguing that Article 88, contemptuous words against the president and other officials, is unconstitutional as applied to retiree. I'm like, sure, make me a test case here. But do I honestly want to go through that? No, because the punishment is the process, but I'm sure I'd have some free legal advice, free legal representation. But the bottom line is Congress absolutely needs to finally remove jurisdiction, military law, military criminal jurisdiction over retirees. Reservists who are not on active duty orders don't have jurisdiction over them. So this really goes back to the Civil War, the end of the Civil War. The United States didn't have a reserve component. And so the military, the Congress was concerned that maybe some of these retirees would have to be called back up if the Civil War reignited. But then we've developed over the century and a half since the Civil War a robust reserve component. We've got the National Guard. And mind you, even the reservists, and they're the ones that will be called up if the balloon goes
including Hegseth. Hegseth served in the Guard and the reserves. He was
right. And so if he was still a reservist, right, when he's not on active duty orders, he's not subject to the code. So
and
why,
what are contemptuous?
Why should some 90-year-old retiree, I'm not 90, but why should some old retiree be told they can't smoke marijuana, which is still a crime under the criminal law? But really the concern is there are some crimes in the military under the military code that restrict one's First Amendment rights to a greater degree than for a civilian. And that's the concern here. But separately from that, right, Secretary Hegseth is not court-martialing Senator Kelly. He's trying to do something different. And that is abuse the administrative process without any legal basis to try to punish him or tribute against him for actually challenging the administration. And
as you said, he's not going for court-martial because there isn't evidence,
right.
Which reminds me of the fact that there were 2 survivors that didn't get killed after the first boat strike. There were survivors that they killed, murdered, I would say. And then there was a second episode where there were survivors of the shipwreck that they brought aboard and then debated what to do with. And instead of bringing them back to America and trying them, they released them back to their home countries because there was no evidence that they could present.
Because they destroyed all the evidence by blowing up the boat instead of doing what our Coast Guard and Navy have been doing for years now, which is interdicting boarding based on reasonable basis, which is the standard for the law of the sea, international law, reasonable basis that they have, they're committing a crime, that they have their drugs on board, and then arresting them and seizing the evidence under standard criminal procedure laws, which is how we dismantle a drug cartel one person at a time. We don't do it by just blowing up these alleged drug smugglers. And these aren't the high-level cartel guys. It's the poor guys that can't find work otherwise, right? And so the whole thing, and so now if we're going to shift over to that illegal murder campaign and that we actually have going on in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, I find the whole thing to be it's murder. It's what we would call crimes against humanity because it's systematic and widespread. It's
like
no
genocide.
War.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason that President Trump just said that there's a non-international armed conflict, that is a type of war, but at the same time his administration is saying, but it's not a war that requires Congress to approve it. So they want their cake and eat it too. But the reason they're saying it's a type of armed conflict, because that allows them to kill first, ask questions later. When typically for law enforcement can only use force when it's necessary when they're facing an imminent threat of deadly force in response. right? And so, but now they're killing people because of their membership status, because of claimed membership status, because the administration claims they're parts of some terrorist organization that is running drugs. And that's really frightening, because they've also declared that Antifa is some kind of terrorist organization, so they're going to declare war on them. And that doesn't meet the factual basis. They're actual legal criteria for what is a non-international armed conflict, and those are not
So,
met
and of
here.
course, you're reminding me of what happened in Minnesota, where a protester is deemed to be someone who can be murdered. But I don't want to get into that. But I do want to, you mentioned the First Amendment. In addition to the First Amendment rights that Senator Kelly has, he has speech and debate protection.
Mhm.
Um, but before we talk about those two legal concepts, what he said exactly is, as you've pointed out, the statement of the law. It is
Mhm.
not anything seditious. It is, he said, you have to obey a lawful order and you must disobey an unlawful order. And military members, that's exactly what you would have told them as their JAG advisor, as their legal advisor. And
Well, I'll interrupt you there, because I wouldn't have said exactly that. Fortunately, Senator Kelly didn't say they must disobey unlawful orders.
yeah,
There was one congressman that said that on that video. And I understand they were just being pithy and concise. But the duty to disobey an unlawful order arises in two situations. Because, as you know, Jill, from your time in
right.
with the Army, there is a presumption of legality of all
Yes,
military orders, and obedience to orders is the organizational lifeblood of what a military and our military has run on, because of the need for military good order and discipline, and effectiveness, and the adherence to the chain of command. It's not that it's not the obedience of an automaton, of a robot, to quote our military courts. But it's pretty instinctive and reflective of obedience. However, the duty to disobey an unlawful order arises when a soldier or sailor, Marine, Koski, etc., either knows that the order is unlawful, or that it's so manifestly patently unlawful that a person of ordinary understanding would know. And that comes from the William Kelly horrible war crimes case, in which he murdered. I mean, he was only convicted of murdering a little over 30, but the evidence showed that there were,
right.
many, men, women, and children that he murdered. And he claimed that he was following a superior order. And as we learned from the Nuremberg trials, if everything can be excused because of superior orders, then that's how we engage in crimes of atrocity and things like the Holocaust, etc. And so our military court said, look, you should have known this,
Right.
right? But my point is that unless it rises that level, if some airman doesn't understand that constitutionally the president really should be going to Congress before invading Greenland, that's high levels of constitutional law and war powers. That sure, we can argue that an order would be unlawful, but it doesn't mean that
Right.
airman or that private actually has a duty to disobey. So, but just by
But
saying if it's
but
you have so.
in the case of our own manual, it specifically says, for example, that shooting a shipwreck survivor is a war crime. That's the example. So it seems to me that, at least in that case, you would know. Normally, you would have advice from a JAG officer as to what is and isn't lawful. But in the moment of combat, you may not know. I understand that. But of course, none of this is relevant to Senator Kelly and his remarks.
Right, he did nothing criminal. That video did nothing. I mean, I would have been more nuanced with my choice of words in the video, but they didn't say anything that would at all be cross the line to anything that would be contemptuous words, conduct prejudicial to good order, discipline. Of course, not seditious, right? There's going to be an
Right.
intent to subvert, civilian control. And so it's really this whole thing is simply ridiculous, but it's not ridiculous in the fact that it's incredibly disturbing that we have a sitting cabinet member, a sitting secretary, that's so willing to engage in retribution against a senator, which means Senator Kelly's really triggered really triggered Mr. Secretary Hegseth, which on one hand makes me happy because Secretary Hegseth is the most unqualified Secretary of Defense we have ever had. He should never been appointed, should never been approved by the Senate. And he is morally corroding our service members, our entire military, because of these illegal campaigns that he's engaged in. And I'm really looking forward to the federal court making a decision. So I'll explain what happened. So
Well,
Senator Kelly,
stop for a minute because
sure.
we've abandoned, obviously, he abandoned the idea of court martial because there was no
Mhm.
crime. But he's now operating under a different procedure, which is censure and covered by, I believe, the Procedures Act. And so, what procedures does Kelly have available to him? What does he have to do now that he's been censured? Can he sue? Yes, he can. He has done that. How likely is he to succeed, and how long will it take?
I think he's going to succeed very quickly in federal court. I don't think there's any administrative remedies that he actually has to exhaust here, because there really are no administrative remedies to an act that is what we call as lawyers ultra vires. Secretary Hegseth is already acting outside of the law, so there is no remedy for something that's already illegal. One could argue, well, Secretary Kelly has to wait until he's actually administratively demoted, and then go to the naval equivalent of the Board of Corrections of Military Records, blah blah blah. I don't think a court's going to find that he has to go through that, because this is so outside of what the
Yeah.
statutory basis is. And there's a second issue here, and that's a due process one. The fact that you've had the president weigh in on Secretary Kelly's so-called guilt, initially after that video was released. You've got Secretary Hegseth making numerous social media comments condemning Senator Kelly. There's that kind of command influence, because the commander in
Right.
chief and Secretary Hegseth is the next in line for the National Command Authority, completely taints any decision making that the Secretary of Navy could be, is being really ordered to engage in right now. And so that's again why I don't think the federal court that Senator Kelly filed in for injunctive relief is going to require him to do anything else, because any proceedings will be tainted and already tainted as part of a command influence, and I find that to be a pure due process violation. So
We're
I
facing
think
the same thing in Minnesota, where the
Mhm.
president and the Secretary of Homeland Security have both said the Agent Ross, the ICE agent who shot and killed Renee Good, is innocent. He was acting in self-defense. She's the one who brought it on herself. She's the guilty one. She's a domestic terrorist. Uh, That seems to me prejudgment of the worst kind. But
Of course.
if this had been done on active duty, if he hadn't been retired for almost 15 years, Senator Kelly, if he had been on active duty, would his having said this be conduct unbecoming?
No, not at all. But it's really hard to imagine this happening on active duty, because a sitting senator can't be on active duty. Per the Constitution, you can't have one person be a member of two of our three branches, right? They can be a member of
Well,
one.
okay, if
And
before he
that's
became
why.
a senator, he said this while on active duty, would that have
Well,
qualified
then I
as
would have been court-martialed, and so would have all my colleagues for telling folks what the law is, right? And so,
okay?
so this is conduct unbecoming an officer's via speech. Per our courts have been things like an officer writing a young girl and explaining all sorts of sexual acts to her. Um, Things like advising a fellow military member on how to strap a device to your legs to avoid to use fake urine in order to subvert a urinalysis. That's found to be conduct unbecoming, as it obviously
Okay.
is. And so it's got to be something pretty darn egregious. This isn't
And
even
didn't Hegseth
criminal.
say the same thing when he was a Fox host? Now, I don't know if he was on if he was in the reserves when he did that. I don't know when he left the reserves, but should he be censured? Of course, he's not getting a pension, so none of this matters because that's the only
Right, there's
grounds that
there's
they
there's
have.
nothing to be taken away, and
Yeah.
again, I'll be honest, I wrote an op-ed right after that video came out, before Secretary Hegseth, you know, and President Trump's just egregious response to it. I was bothered by that video because I don't like using the military as political in political forum like that. And I felt like that was politicizing the military. If you want to remind the top generals and admirals, hey, you guys, be really careful. We do think there's some unlawful orders going to be coming down. That's one thing. But just to do a very black and white, unnuanced video, it felt like to me that you're putting those service members, the junior officers, the lower ranking folks, a bit of an immoral quandary of, oh, but I don't know which ones are unlawful. What are you trying to tell me to do? Blah, blah, blah. I thought I'm supposed to be, instinctively following orders and that there's a presumption of legality for orders. So I do wish it had been more nuanced, but the bottom line is there was nothing criminal, unethical or immoral about that video, about anything that Senator Kelly has said.
And I would
Zero.
take issue with you to say that I think that to the extent that it is a warning, an alert to active duty members to say, I have to remember that there is no Nuremberg defense, that I cannot just say I was following orders. I need to ask a JAG officer if this is legal. And as you said, there is a presumption of legality. And in fact, of course, the Office of Legal Counsel has written an opinion that we haven't seen, which I hope someday we will, that says that it is lawful to do what they are doing in terms of striking these boats. So that might help the person who is at the lower level implementing it. But it raises an issue. But let's move to the other issue that is disturbing, which was only revealed a few days ago. The New York Times reported that the U.S. had attacked a boat with an aircraft that looked like a civilian plane. And even if the Trump administration's claim that there is an armed conflict, and as you have pointed out, not clear that there is, because if there is, they should have congressional authorization, and they don't say they don't need one. But even if it were true, there is something called perfidy. And so talk about that and whether using a plane to bomb that looks like it's a civilian plane, wouldn't that be the same as putting a tank with a red cross on it so that it wouldn't be attacked? Because you're not supposed to attack ambulances and other medical vehicles. So talk about that.
Sure. As you pointed out, Jill, there is no non-international armed conflict against these drug cartels because there has to be organized armed groups with the capacity and will to be waging violence against the United States, sustained, prolonged violence. And there actually has to be hostilities of sustained, prolonged violence between us and them. And there hasn't been that. But let's pretend, like the administration is, that we're actually in an armed conflict against these drug cartels, and regarding the series of blowing up, of striking. I think it's over 30 now drug boats with over 100 individuals killed in the process, murdered in my professional opinion. The laws of war prohibit perfidy. They allow for ruses. So what's the difference? So if we go back to the fundamental rule of the law of war, that is the fundamental bedrock premise that divides the world between fighters, combatants, and civilians. We consider ourselves civilized because we said we're going to all agree, the community of nations, that we're just going to, fighters will fight fighters. We're going to leave civilians alone. Occasionally, civilians may be hurt because they're collateral damage. They're near, right, when it's proportional, they're near a military objective,
Right.
lawful military objective. Or if a civilian acts like a fighter and decides to join the fight, then we can kill them for what they're doing. But we're going to protect civilians and civilian objects. So therefore, when a Hamas member who is not wearing a uniform is saying, kill me, I'm the fighter. Kill me. That's why we say thank you for your service to military members, because they're wearing a target on their back every day. That's the point of the uniform, is to be a target so that we protect our civilians. Shoot me, don't shoot that civilian over there. And so when Hamas isn't wearing a uniform and looks like a civilian, they are trying to deceive who they're fighting into thinking they're civilian so that they won't be shot, so that they can shoot them, right? That is the classic example of perfidy, is feigning, pretending to be a civilian in order to injure, kill, or capture the enemy, because you want them, you're inviting them to intentionally inviting them to rely on your civilian status in order to gain some kind of
Right.
tactical advantage. And the same thing would for a civilian object, like you said, and protected objects like an ambulance with the red crescent or the red cross symbol on it. Um, that is given particular protection under the law of war. So if a party, if a fighting force uses that ambulance with the red cross in it, with fighters in it, because they want to gain some kind of tactical advantage that will be given to them by the enemy's reliance on the protected status, they're not going to get shot at, so they can get a lot closer to the enemy to shoot. Classic perfidy. So now let's go back to the actual example we're talking about here. And I have to say, I took issue with the New York Times initial reporting on this, because it's not clear that it's perfidy. It's absolutely not without more facts, because we need intent. So there has to be, let's look at the context here. The context is this is the very first boat strike in this campaign of murder that Secretary of War Hegseth has engaged in. So you have sounds like it was a surveillance aircraft that that does not have the typical markings on it, a surveillance aircraft that has weapons on it, but one that looks like a civilian aircraft. So it's up there flying around. I really think this was a target of opportunity, and they identified a boat with members of the alleged members of the drug cartel that was allegedly carrying drugs on it. And Secretary Hegseth gave an order: "Hey, a target of opportunity. Let's start this campaign. Let's shoot this now." Just the mere fact that they used an aircraft that looked civilian doesn't make it perfidy, because perfidy requires, who are they trying to deceive? What tactical advantage did they need? This boat, the
Right.
speedboat, didn't have AAA on it, anti-aircraft artillery. They weren't expecting to get blown out of the water. There was no civilian status that was needed, or that would even give them an advantage, because what is that boat going to evade a plane? So to me, it just seems that wasn't needed. It's ridiculous to even think that. I think this was purely just a dumb move, but it wasn't perfidy, because that requires someone said, let's use a civilian looking aircraft so they don't think we're the military, so we can get closer to bomb them. You didn't need to. No one's fighting back. You didn't need that. So that's why I think this looks bad, because it makes us look like we're not taking into proper
Right.
consideration civilian status. But I don't think this is perfidy, because it lacks that intent. And that, all the ringing in the New York Times, and, a couple of folks that have been quoted from the military. I mean, Professor Jeff Korn in that first article is the only one that got it actually right. And that's because it depends. The answer depends. So for those of us that have actually advised on operations, advised on the issue of perfidy, know this. And not everyone being quoted is actually advised on this. And so I would just say, okay, I don't like anything this administration is doing. I criticize the heck out of it, but I have to have integrity. And it's not perfidy unless we have more here. It's
That is such an
problematic.
interesting, very interesting perspective that I think needs to be amplified. That is something that hasn't come out in the press. And because this show is called Just the Facts, it's really important to say this depends on what the facts were, whether it was a deliberate attempt to deceive. And as you point out, why would you deceive a unarmed boat? And why wouldn't you follow the normal rules that the Coast Guard interdict the boat, stop it, search it, and if there is something on it, if there is contraband, you seize the contraband, you arrest the people on the boat, you bring them back for trial. We have never done that. We have bombed first without any proof to any of us, to Congress, to any citizen, that there is in fact something. And because we keep saying perfidy, for anyone who has watched one battle after another, you know that one of the characters' name is Perfidy Beverly Hills. And I never really thought about the deception that implies, but I think everyone should see the movie, which of course is getting so many awards that obviously you should see it anyway. But now keep in mind that Rachel has pointed out what the crime, the laws of war bar perfidy. But there you go. I'm so glad you were able to spend this time with us and I know that I'm going to have you back because there are so many other things to talk about. Um, we've talked about the strikes on the boats. I don't remember if you and I have talked about the strike on Maduro's country, on the land, and his seizure, but we will on a future episode get to that as well, and to any other things that the Secretary of Defense, I will not obey him and call him anything other than his lawful name, Secretary of Defense. And I also might question whether he is the worst ever, because I have at least one other candidate in mind for worst ever. But I would certainly agree he is, if not the worst, he's one of the top 2 or 3 for sure. Um, and
I
you are
concur.
one of the best ever. So I really appreciate your being here, and hope that everyone has gotten a much deeper understanding of the rules of defense and the rules of war. And thank you for sharing with us, Rachel.
Thank you, Jill. And I do want to go back and add, I wasn't trying to ding anyone that was quoted in the New York Times, because as someone that
Eh,
deals with the media, I realize that often your quotes are cherry picked.
Yes,
So they may have
yes,
provided this greater detail and it just wasn't included. And I know everyone is doing their darndest to provide,
right,
objective advice, objective analysis of what's going on. And I just will leave it to, even if it wasn't perfidy, then it demonstrates just the ham-handedness, the lack of thought and professionalism and care that's going into taking people's lives, right? A lot of Americans, I've been disturbed, like, oh, but they're drug runners. I'm like, we don't know they're drug runners. And
right,
drug running is not a capital offense in the United States. These folks are not an imminent threat to the United States, right? We're not in a war against them. They're trying to sell us stuff. They're not trying to kill us. And so it's just really disturbing, the entire narrative and rhetoric that's going around this. But let's not forget, this administration is directing our military members to kill people outside of what is the normal legal basis for
right.
doing so, and that is not fair to our service members, and it's not fair to our whole country.
And it's not fair to our citizens who are
Mhm.
subjected to murder by ICE agents either. Thank you,
100%.
Rachel. Glad you were here.
Thanks, Jill.